All right, welcome to episode 40 of Seize the Moment podcast. Today we have a very special guest. Her name is Skye Cleary, and she's the author of Existentialism and Romantic Love and co-editor of the book How to Live a Good Life. She teaches at Columbia University, City College of New York, and Barnard College, and previously at the New York Public Library. Skye is also the editor-in-chief of the American Philosophical Association's blog. She has a black belt in taekwondo, and she loves scuba diving. Welcome, Skye.
Thanks, Alan. Hi, Liam.
Hey, Skye. Thank you so much for coming on. So, the first question I'm going to ask is, I think that's pretty much the one that our listeners are going to want to know about the most. For me as an existential therapist, people often ask me, what the hell is existential therapy? So it's one of those things where it's like existentialism is such an obscure term that I would say the vast majority of people have never heard of. So the kind of question is not only what is existentialism, but how is it relevant to me? So a lot of times kind of what I find myself sort of trying to figure out is how to help people understand existentialism in the context of their lives. So for Skye, to put that to you, right, what is existential philosophy, right, and how is it relevant to our lives? Why should we know about it?
Yeah. It's hard to define what existentialism is because so many people have so many different definitions, and it wasn't an official school or anything, but there are overlapping themes. Things like the central theme is freedom, so acknowledging that we are freedom, and emphasizing the value of the choices that we make and taking responsibility for those choices, but knowing that also that kind of responsibility can create a lot of anxiety. But we need to do it because the reward is authenticity. Mm-hmm. So in a nutshell, that is how I would describe it. And why is it relevant? Well, I think that existentialism was a reaction to what Nietzsche declared as God is dead and we have killed him, or her maybe. So the existentialism was kind of trying to answer that question, what do we do next? Dostoevsky, one of his characters, wrote, if God is dead, then anything goes. But the existential philosophers were like, well, no, because then we're just going to descend into anarchy. So what do we do with it then? And the answer is, recognize ourselves as free and responsible for our actions. But the problem is, and something Simone de Beauvoir particularly pointed out, was that there are a lot of limitations on our freedom, like oppression and ignorance and poverty, and there are things like weighing on us that make it difficult for us to choose into an open future.
So then how do we make sense of, let's say, authenticity and becoming, I guess, what you can call your authentic self in the context of all of these constraints that we have?
Yeah, so it can be tricky. And I think one of the things that drew me to existentialism in the first place was the idea that, becoming aware of the pressures around us, but also the internal pressures that we place on ourselves that we may not be fully cognizant of, like the pressures that we kind of internalize. And what I like about the existential idea of authenticity is that it's about it puts the focus on being self-determining and choosing and working towards self-chosen goals, but also at the same time respecting freedom, not just only for ourselves, but also for other people, because, we share the world and other people exist and they're kind of a fact of our existence. So authenticity, I understand as taking charge of our own lives and, doing what we think is genuine and right, but knowing that it's not always easy to figure out what's genuine and right. And that's why, there's a lot of, Simone de Beauvoir wrote The Ethics of Ambiguity, emphasizing that, situations are so complex and, these decisions that we make can be very...
That's right. Yeah, and yes, and I like how there's this sort of metacognition that takes place. Right, we think about how our actions, not only how our own actions impact our lives, but how our actions impact the lives of others, and also thinking about what other people are thinking. Our thoughts in relation to theirs, how they feel, how they're acting, and that's something that's very valuable in existentialism, taking into consideration not just yourself and your own feelings, wants, actions, beliefs, but also taking in consideration the other and sort of the feedback that you get from the other, and sort of determining who you are in relation to the other. And that's an interesting relationship that goes on there.
Yeah. And Skye, it does seem like kind of with the existentialist that the idea or the main, I guess one of the main core tenets is that we are never alone. And it's not as though man, even though being, or man, woman, right, sort of being authentic, that we can never really be authentic on an island of our own. That we actually need people in some way to kind of validate our authenticity and to kind of give us an understanding of who we are.
Yeah, definitely. And I like Jean-Paul Sartre, how he talks about this. And he says that there are a few different levels of self-understanding. So if we walk around in the world, there's, just ordinary self-reflection. Like we wander down the street and think, oh, it's a lovely day. And then there's a much deeper self-reflection, which is, well, how do I feel about this day? But then there's an even deeper type of introspection that can only be gained through other people. Like, well, how do other people see this day? And so it's and so he goes so far to say that we wouldn't know ourselves without the other person, because it's like an idea that just as the eye can't see itself, there's only so much we can get through looking in a mirror, and understanding how other people view us just adds a whole deeper level of understanding to our being.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of a Thomas Cooley quote. I'm not who I think I am. I'm not who you think I am. I am who I think you think I am.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's kind of like that it goes with what you said. There's this sort of feedback that takes place in where, that's kind of how you know who you are in relation to others.
Yeah. Well, and even through the interpretation of how you see the other person seeing you.
Well, yeah, because you can't possibly be in their exact shoes knowing exactly what they're thinking. So that's why you can only know so much. Right? There's still a little bit of separation there between you and what they really think of you. But it's the best we can do.
Yeah. And then Scott, go ahead.
I was just going to say, but it's difficult because you don't want to be completely defined by the other person, because then you're going to completely betray, your authentic self, but you also need to take into account what the other people think. And something else Jean-Paul Sartre points out is that he gives the example of spying through a keyhole, and he hears steps behind him, and he doesn't feel shame until he sees himself through the gaze of the other. And but his point is also that if we don't know that person, if we don't really care about them, then we're not really going to know, or not going to care what they think about us. But the more we like that person, especially if we love that person, then it really matters to us how they see us. So our relationship to the other person also determines kind of how much we take their views into account of us. That's why he actually said hell is other people.
So then how can we kind of strike a balance between the two, right? Sort of not caring at all what other people think of us and caring too much. What would that look like according to them?
Yeah, it's really hard. I don't think there's a straightforward answer, and it's a constant negotiation of because if you're all about being self-determining and not taking into anyone's view into account, then you become really self-centered and
narcissistic.
Yeah. Exactly. But then if you're completely determined by what other people think, then you're kind of like a slave to the gaze of other people. And so I think it's a constant negotiation to try and figure out, try and, work our way in between both of those things.
And go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'll say that.
Okay. So what's so cool about Sartre and De Beauvoir is, often, and I found this in my relationships too, to kind of be frank, is that sort of when previous years of dating where I would date people, right, we would kind of be on different ends of the spectrum, where I would sort of try to stand my ground and I would say, no, I'm right, and then the other person would say, I'm right, right? And then so, objectively speaking, obviously this doesn't really make sense because we don't really know how to kind of negotiate a relationship in any sort of manualized, concrete way. And so what I really liked about kind of your understanding of it, and obviously also their relationship as it was the fact that they knew that there was no blueprint for life, which is like this really another core existential idea. And so even though they made a lot of mistakes along the way, they kind of knew that there was no real right answer. So I mean, I don't know obviously if they fought or not. I'm sure they did because it was a relationship. But what was so cool about them is them understanding that the differences they had were to kind of they were existential in the sense that they were just an inherent part of humanity. It wasn't that like she's not seeing the right way or he's not seeing the right perspective. It was essentially that no, we just have different perspectives and now we have to negotiate and figure out how to make this work for the both of us. So in your understanding, what was their relationship like? Like how did they make it work?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't perfect by any means. And I mean, it's hard for me to judge that, but there's been so much written about them, and they published a lot of their diaries and letters, so it's hard not to pry a little bit. But yeah, they had an open relationship, and they tried to live their philosophies, and they worked through their problems together with varying success. And I think one of the important things about their relationship, which I think is really important for people to remember, is that, if you're free to choose to be in a relationship, you're also free to choose to leave. Mm-hmm. And so they, never saw their relationship as a given. And I think that's a really healthy way to look at it. Like, relationships are always contingent. Now, they actually made their relationship, or they had a pact making their relationship primary, and they said we can have contingent relationships outside of that. But I kind of see that as a little bit in contradiction with their philosophy, because if they made their relationship fixed, then they weren't recognizing each other's freedom and the freedom to leave. But I think in practice, their relationship was still somewhat contingent. And I think that's important, not to let one another take each other for granted. So I think that's kind of a healthy way to look at it.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, it definitely wasn't fixed because they weren't under the whole marriage contract, right?
Yeah.
And that's actually something that's very fascinating and refreshing about their relationship, is that they still cared for one another. It's just that they also valued each other's freedom, and probably being the time period that they were in, they would see other relationships. They decided they didn't want to do it the way other people did. Yeah. So, I mean, there wasn't a clear-cut way as to how they should run their relationship. So obviously they didn't get it perfect. But I could definitely see why you drew inspiration from how their relationship was conducted, because if you think about it, the whole abiding by a contract or a sort of rigid structure that you can't really deviate from if your feelings change or emotions change, or just after some time you find something else like different about the person. It could be very restricting and lead to a bad relationship ultimately. Yeah. So I feel like they were just trying to find some way out of that trap by doing it the way they did. Mm-hmm. So they didn't figure out the perfect way to do it. And of course, existentialism isn't a prescriptive sort of philosophy. Mm-hmm. But what's fascinating about existentialism is there's sort of an opening in existentialism to attempt to try to understand the other, to really try to look at their perspective while being aware of what it is that you want, and as we discussed earlier, kind of negotiating how you want to conduct your relationship.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's important. And the reality is that, almost 50% of people get divorced anyway now. So it's not like they're really taking this marriage commitment seriously. Mm. And Simone de Beauvoir said, she doesn't think anyone should be bound to another person out of anything other than love, or because you want to be with that person. Shouldn't have to be with someone, because, of a certificate. That's a kind of an oppressive way to look at it. And it's something that's oppressed women, especially for thousands of years. And they didn't have a choice often whether to go into a marriage, and certainly rarely to leave a marriage. And so I think, marriage is kind of a bit of a hangover. but at the same time, I think there's still a lot of value in marriage. And the reality is, she and Sartre did kind of have like a marriage. They didn't have the certificate, but for all intents and purposes, their relationship was very much like a marriage. So, I mean, I'm not sure what the alternative is, but I think it is important to, if you are going to get married, to recognize that it's not something that is, I guess, should bind you forever.
Actually, I could kind of, I think I might be seeing where you're coming from. It could be something that you might do, like culturally, maybe just something to just add some sort of structure to your relationship as time progresses. And there is something to having a structure. It does kind of let you know where some, like by putting a label on something. Yes, it is restrictive, and it does sound like something that's static, right? However, it also provides kind of an understanding of your place in the relationship, or the other person's place as well. And so in that sense, there is something to marriage that's very interesting in that respect, but that the part of it that's restricting, as I'm kind of lost my thread.
It's okay.
Right?
I think like what you guys are pretty much getting at is that it has to be an agreement that the marriages themselves aren't really bad, right? It's just that the thing is, like, when you look at the era, it seemed like a lot of obviously people, and then a lot of sort of communities and families had the sort of the shackles of marriage, right? Where they pretty much made, let's say, kind of, especially when it came to women, right? Women had these expectations of when they were supposed to be married, to whom they were supposed to be married to, and so when I was listening to the both of you, I was thinking of this story. So in the Victoria era, during Sigmund Freud's time, so one of, like, in psychology classes, one of the first cases that they usually give us is this case of Anna O. So I don't really remember her real name, but she was actually the founder of social work, and she's considered to be like the first female psychoanalyst. So she was actually not technically Freud's patient, so she was the patient of Freud's predecessor, Joseph Breuer. Mm-hmm. And then so she actually fell in love with him. So at the time, right, so during that period, pretty much the relationships were kind of stale, and, kind of women and men were sort of compartmentalized. Women mostly at work, and they were kind of more business oriented, and, kind of women were like the stay-at-home moms. And so the expectation was that, the father was very stoic, not in the real sense of stoicism. I mean, like, very sort of emotionally detached. And so, kind of the wife was pretty much expected to take care of the emotional needs of everybody in the family, except for herself. And so during that period, right, she ended up seeing Joseph Breuer for psychotherapy, and she was given the term hysteria, right? She was hysterical, right? Because God forbid this woman has her own needs, right? She's just crazy. And so she ended up falling in love with him. And so the story goes that he actually ended up falling in love with her too. And so because they had this really deep and intimate bond. And so in the when they tell the story, so pretty much she actually wanted him to, like, become kind of physical with her, not sexual, but she actually, like, requested that he start touching her as well. And he's like, oh no, like, I can't do that. And so what was so interesting, and I guess in a sense tragical about the story, is that because their society was what it was, and they had the expectations that they had, so if they were obviously able to ever get together, I mean, first of all, it was unethical in terms of, like, the relationship between the client and the therapist, but then also on top of that, so she was actually, I don't think she was married, he definitely was, and she was, I think, maybe she was, her parents had somebody in mind for her or something, or like she had a fiance. I don't remember what the exact story was, but so the point was that it was kind of like one of these sort of tragic, like Romeo and Juliet type loves, which wasn't that extreme. But so pretty much in the story, like she I think eventually sort of revealed to him that she was, like, really, like, intensely in love with him, but he kind of, like, ran away from this. Like, as soon as he found out, he's like, oh my God, I gotta get the hell out of here. Literally ran away. He actually, like, walked out of the session, and, like, she never saw him again. And so he went back to his wife, and then his wife was really jealous. Like, when she found out, she's like, you're never seeing her again, like, this is over. And so what was so tragic about it is that she actually never married after that. So she became this brilliant academic and intellectual, and sort of like one of the prominent figures in the field of psychoanalysis. But the idea was that she thought that this relationship was so phenomenal and so sort of like not necessarily idealistic, but so kind of anti-mundane is kind of the best way that I could put it. Mm-hmm. That she knew that she would never find anything like that. And so the idea was that the kind of ideal bourgeois marriage at the time was so antithetical to this relationship that she had to this person, that she was like, there's no way that I'm ever going to find this again, so now I'm going to just devote myself to my career and my professional life. And she was brilliant. She was gorgeous. She had so much going for her. But the thing is, because of the way society was structured and the ways the kind of like pretty much the cultural expectations for men and women at the time pretty much made her feel pretty hopeless about ever finding anything close to that. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a really sad story.
Yeah, but I think that kind of goes into sort of marriage and what it is sometimes, that people have these expectations of what kind of marriage is supposed to be like, and then what happens is obviously it's pretty much like, so when people feel like they need to marry someone or they need to be in a relationship, what happens is they often choose partners that maybe are not great for them. Like the story that you told, right, in the book about the kind of person you were with. Not necessarily for the same reason. But what happens, unfortunately, a lot of the times is that when there's sort of social and cultural pressure to get married, is that people end up marrying the wrong person, right? They marry someone who just is not kind of an emotional fit, who's not an intellectual fit. And then it's like, for her, what happened was obviously she found this person who she did find to be a great fit. And he challenged her intellectually, right? He was there for her emotionally, but the thing is, it's like based on kind of the choices that they made and sort of the norms at the time that they weren't able to be together.
Yeah, and I think going back to what you were saying about the right person, there's also, this idea that the one is out there and we just need to find them. And I think that's, very destructive, because there's rarely one. It's rarely, always happy, and it's rarely ever after. Yeah. And, this is the romantic ideal that, we find this person and then we merge together in an ecstatic oneness. And I think that's, and certainly the existential philosophers saw that could be very destructive to relationships. Hegel said that when one consciousness meets another, they get into these dynamics, and this is the master-slave dialectic, so they kind of tussle until one person becomes the master and the other person becomes the slave. And Sartre talked about that and said, and this is why all love is doomed to kind of sadomasochism, and lovers are always going to be in tension. But Simone de Beauvoir, I think, and why I'm attracted to her philosophy, is that she says, why does everything have to be about domination and submission? Why can't we just sort of transcend, these ideas of possession and, respect one another, and instead of striving towards this oneness with another person, let's focus more on friendship and having that be like a better and stronger foundation for relationships that can transcend those power struggles.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what was interesting about your husband was at the time when you first met him and you told him, oh, I'm going to be doing a PhD, and he thought it was cool, automatically. I mean, I understand, you said that automatically was like you were in love, but at the same or that you wanted to get married right away. But then, not exactly, but it was somebody who you had like extreme compatibility with, and that was very refreshing, as opposed to the other guy before who, while you were doing your MBA, just wanted more time from you and all that, instead of kind of respecting what it is that is your passion or what it is that you want to accomplish in life. And that's definitely refreshing, right? If you can tell somebody everything that it is that you want to do, and they can respect, that it's going to take some time and you won't be able to give all your time to them, and they can respect that, that almost makes you love them more, right? You would think you want all their time, that you would want all that time to be in love with them, to share time with them. But when they respect the amount of time that you want to yourself or to accomplish certain goals, paradoxically, it kind of does something else to the relationship. Yeah. And it actually brings me to this quote that you had in there. Authentic love must be founded on reciprocal recognition of two freedoms. Each lover would then experience himself and as the other. Neither would abdicate his transcendence. They would not mutilate themselves. Together they would not mutilate themselves. Together they would both reveal values and ends in the world. For each of them, love would be the revelation of self through the gift of self and the enrichment of the universe. That's beautiful, right? Because you're able to completely express what it is that is your deepest desire and what it is that you want to do, and they can do the same for you. Mm-hmm. And not a lot of relationships have that. A lot of it, I mean, either way, there's going to be compromise in the relationship and negotiating, but being able to go to this level of vulnerability and to be able to express yourself in this way, that's amazing. Not everyone has that at all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems like.
No.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Scott.
Sorry, I was just going to say, and what I like about this Simone de Beauvoir quote is that, that emphasis on something that sounds much more like a good, deep friendship. And in fact, Nietzsche said, something like, it's not a lack of love that makes for unhappy marriages, it's a lack of friendship. And I don't want to reduce love to friendship as such, but I do want to say that love with the foundation of friendship is, I think, much more powerful and can create much stronger relationships than the kind of traditional, romantic ideal of oneness.
Yeah, and I mean, I wonder, right? It's like when it comes to kind of love, right? Were they ever possessive of each other, Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre?
Oh, definitely.
They were? Okay. So it was just their sort of conception, right, rather than the actuality, at least for the most part.
Mean, they weren't perfect, and they said themselves, absolutely, we're not perfect. We've made a lot of mistakes. They were definitely both jealous and possessive. And in fact, Sartre said that something like if someone asked him, because he had, lots of women, in his circle, and they said, "Oh, and do your women have other men?" And he's like, "Well, if they do, they don't tell me, and I wouldn't like it if they did." But at the same time, and I think they tried to be as generous as possible towards one another. But of course, they were human as well. But I think they kept trying to bring it back to a foundation of the authentic love quote that you kind of read up before, which is respecting and acknowledging one another's freedom and trying not to be dominating and jealous and possessive. But what's also interesting is that Jean-Paul Sartre didn't necessarily subscribe to Beauvoir's kind of ideal of authentic love that you described there. I mean, he thought that you could never get out of this, vicious circle of sadism and masochism and possessiveness. He thought that, we're constantly stuck in there. Although he did write some notes, like later on in his life, that said, oh, maybe we can, transcend that towards authentic love, like Beauvoir talked about. But then he says, well, then maybe it won't be love anymore. So I think he never kind of resolved that tension.
And it kind of seems like it's an inability of sort of trusting our own worth. Because, I mean, from what I know about, like, possessive love and, like, kind of love bombing, a term that I've sort of written about and we talked about before, right, is that so people who pretty much do that, they don't really trust that the other person actually cares for them and loves them. So, I mean, the idea is usually is that, like, I have to possess you and I have to know kind of everywhere about or sort of everything that you're doing because I don't believe that you'll actually kind of stick around. So they sort of become authoritarian figures in the relationships. And so, I mean, I think this is going to sound super idealistic, and I don't know to what extent it's obviously possible, but there would have to be at least some level of disconnection of self-worth from romantic love, to some extent. Obviously, you're never going to get it fully, and it's probably not even going to be worth it if you ever, like, sort of just don't care about the other person's opinion. But I think that the ideal could be something in the middle, where you're sort of separating yourself from the person, where you're like 1 foot in a bit, 1 foot out, where on the one hand you're saying that, no, I really need this person's affection and validation, but I need it to the same extent that I need it from my friends, my family, my colleagues. Because if I don't, right, if it's sort of the opposite, where I'm just fully sort of engrossed in this person's validation, then I'm actually going to need them to sort of validate me every single time that I feel like shit about myself, which is pretty much every time that you aren't getting the validation for a lot of people from that other person.
For a lot of people,
yeah.
But I feel like awareness of that is what is the way out, actually. You may be able to, I mean, you're not going to do it perfectly, but I'm sure there is a level you can reach in a relationship where you give, for example, it's more about instead of needing to hear or needing to feel validated, you yourself just offer validation, perhaps, and then the other person does the same in return. But it's not something that you seek out or you need to take or you need to have. I'm probably speaking idealistically, because of course you're not going to have that 100% of the time.
Yeah.
But I'm sure, when you study these sorts of things and you start to have an awareness of where the pitfalls are and what can go wrong and what other people have done wrong, you can learn from that and actually have a very successful relationship, or something that approximates a successful relationship. I mean, Sartre and Beauvoir, with all of their faults, and their relationship wasn't ideal, but they strived for something based on what it is that they already knew existed. They tried to strive for something that was beyond the traditional relationship. So that striving, that's what that's what made their philosophies beautiful, and also their relationship very fascinating and inspiring. It wasn't perfect, but even now, us discussing this, there are people who will be hearing this and also striving to have something approximating a successful relationship, even with there being a 50% divorce rate, and a lot of people just marrying because of societal pressures and all that. There's definitely a way out of that traditional trap and pitfall. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of the traditional ideals of romantic love dates back to like Plato's Symposium. I mean, probably before that, but it was Plato that talked about it. How that myth of Aristophanes, where we used to be these creatures with 4 arms, 4 legs, 2 faces, and one day we upset the gods, and so Zeus cut everyone in 2, and ever since then we've been kind of floating the universe looking for our other half to merge back into like this organic unity. But I think that's a very powerful myth and a very powerful way of talking about love, because it suggests that there is a perfect match out there, or someone who's perfect enough to compensate for our deficiencies and excesses. But it's also very damaging, because it suggests that well, at least it puts a lot of pressure on our romantic partner to be everything for us, to validate us, to kind of balance us out. And I mean, this is something that wasn't around before we had romantic love. People were married to one person, but then they had friends and family and stuff as well. But now, more often, we're expecting the other person to be everything for us, and I think that's a lot of pressure, and I think it can create a lot of tension and unhappiness in relationships.
Yeah, because it seems like we're not really kind of respecting the other person's needs as well. And so, I mean, the thing is, the way I kind of see it is, so I know, like, clinically speaking, the idea is that it's sort of pathological if you need constant validation, but I'm actually starting to kind of get the sense that all of us need constant validation. So I think kind of the healthy form of constant validation is to sort of get it from different sources. So because it's like, I mean, I hear it, and I know people say, like, oh, you shouldn't need constant validation, but from everybody that I've literally ever met in my entire life, we all need constant validation. But the thing is that what happens, I think, like, from what we're saying, is that the people get into relationships and they expect their partner to be that one constant source of validation. And what happens is, obviously, I mean, the other person has other needs and wishes, and they get burned out, and they can't always be there to sort of pick you up, right? Like, I think we always need each other to pick us up, but we need a community of people to pick each other up, right? It's not like where it's like you have sort of on this pedestal, you have romantic love, and then there's everything else. So the way I kind of see happiness, right, to whatever extent it's possible as a sort of end goal, is that we would need a sort of community of people to help us, right? And I mean, like, everybody. I mean, family, friends, right? A romantic partner, children, etc. And sort of we kind of help each other in the way that we pretty much help each other. Like, you help me, I help you, and we kind of work together in this sort of village.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that.
Are you aware of the work of Esther Perel?
Oh yeah, I actually interviewed her about her book State of Affairs when it came out. Must have been a couple of years ago now. Yeah, she's great.
Yeah, no, yeah, because this conversation is just reminding me of her work, because especially nowadays we have as she says, the paradox of choice. There's so many options now in terms of who could be a potential romantic partner. And this is not something that we had years ago, especially before the internet, before Tinder, before this, before that, yada yada yada, all that, right? And so it's fascinating because it creates, I wouldn't say creates problems, but it definitely disrupts certain traditional paradigms of how relationships are structured. Here's the thing. For example, if at the moment that you already dislike something in a particular relationship, because of this abundance of choice, you might actually end up moving on to somebody else. Whereas maybe years ago, you would have either attempted to either resolve it, or maybe not even that nice of a resolution. It would have just been something where you just kind of settle and you stay in that sort of situation.
Well, I have an idea about that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Actually, go on. Actually, that was almost at the end of what I was saying.
Yeah, so I don't know if you guys ever listened to Dan Savage's podcast, The Lovecast. Oh, so he's he's like this really. Oh, you know who Dan Savage is, right? What? Okay, so Dan Savage is like this advice columnist. So he's he's like with his husband in an open marriage. So the way he can.
Oh, this is the good giving and game guy. Good giving and game?
Is
no.
he?
Okay, sorry to interrupt.
Maybe. That's okay. Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure. So I'm not going to say no. So the thing is, like, the way he kind of conceptualizes it and the way I sort of conceptualize this for, like, my clients, this sort of blows them away because they're like, what? Like, who thinks of it this way? I'm like, no, this is like, you're supposed to. So the way he kind of sees it is, so like, he's in an open marriage. And he says, look, you're never going to find a person who's going to be everything that you need them to be, right? He's like, you're never going to find the one because it doesn't exist. So tough shit, right? That's just kind of how life is. But he's like, guess what, right? Your partner, right, isn't going to find the one in you either because you're not perfect either, asshole, and that's okay. So the way he sees it, he's like, when we talk about like settling, it's often obviously this really sort of toxic term, and we're like, oh, I don't want to settle, right? I want somebody who's like, you know, the one or the person for me. So the idea is, the answer is usually, if not always, right, in the middle. So there's no such thing as settling. Well, I mean, there is, but usually when we say settle, what we should be saying is settling for good enough. Another term that's like, oh my God, I don't want somebody who's just good enough, but that's okay. So the way he kind of conceives of it is that, like, if you're looking at it from a 0 to 100, right, what would you say is, like, let's say the number, what would you say is like the number that you would feel comfortable with in terms of a partner, right? She says, for me, it's like a 0.74. And if somebody asks him, like, why a 0.74? Because he's like, all of this is fucking arbitrary. That's why. He's like, it doesn't really matter. He's like, you just pick a number and you go with it. And so for him, his ceiling is 0.74. He's like, if I can find somebody who's or rather his bottom, I'm sorry. So his minimum is his floor is 0.74. So he says, if I find somebody who's a 0.74, I'm absolutely happy with that person. He says, could they be better? Sure. And if they want, like, kind of, we help each other grow. And that's also wonderful. But at the end of the day, I accept the person as he is as a 0.74. So that doesn't necessarily mean that now, like, both of you become complacent. What it does mean is that now that there's a floor for good enough. So for him, the way he sees it is like, if this person is a 0.74, then I accept him as he is, and I love this person as he is if we are in love. But the idea is that I don't now try to change him, because for me, that's good enough. I don't need him to change, right? That's sort of my rational side saying I'm never going to find the one, and just because this person is missing the other 26% now doesn't automatically allow me to now try to force him to become like whatever I want in terms of that 26%. So for Dan Savage, the idea is that like settling and being good enough is actually a wonderful thing. So again, and this doesn't contrast in the way we kind of see it in society with growth, that it doesn't have to be one or the other. You can have a partner growing, and he says, look, that could even be a pretty, or I'm saying this rather, this could even be a part of that 0.74, right? The partner's potential or desire to grow, which is a wonderful thing. But the idea again is that the good enough is actually not a bad thing. It's not black and white where it's either somebody's special and the one, or they're just good enough and they're like awful. No, good enough is good enough.
Yeah. So I don't know about the 0.74 thing, but I think there is kind of an existential idea in there as so this idea that we're not fixed and we're not static and we're not just looking for someone who matches us in that moment, because it's the existential view is that, yeah, whether some of our actions, but we're also, living in the moment and also projecting ourselves into the future, and we're always becoming and always changing, and that's part of the idea of freedom. We are freedom, so there's not like a fixed element to our being in that way. And so when you enter into a relationship with someone, it's, we're going to have different relationships with that same person at different times of our lives. And actually, this is something Esther Perel also talks about. She's like, you might marry someone 3 times in your life, and that person might be the same person each time. And I like that way of framing it, because it emphasizes that we are always doing new things, and we are growing and changing constantly. And maybe we need to, check in with if we're in a committed long-term relationship, we need to check in with our partner, every so often and figure out where it's going. And that reminds me of a Nietzsche quote where he says, it's one of my favorite quotes, and he says, we were two ships who came together to rest in a harbor for a while, and then, we set off again, and the winds blew us in different directions, and maybe we meet each other again, maybe we don't, but that doesn't mean we should, hate each other. And I like that because it says, yeah, we do come and we share, these beautiful moments with people, and sometimes we head off, on our life paths again together. And ideally, I guess for a long-term committed relationship, we keep, changing course together throughout that relationship. But if it ends up that our goals push us in different directions, then that should be okay. And it doesn't mean that the relationship has failed, or that we're a failure, or that the other person is a failure. It just means that we're human, and so
yeah. And it's like the other person a lot of times, well, I think all of us to some extent, right, because we personalize, the way I feel like a lot of people see it is that if love ends, that automatically it didn't exist. That it's like, it's not that love sort of either exists and that you guys just decided to part ways, or the love sort of faded because of whatever reasons, but it's really just, oh, well, I guess it wasn't real and I was never loved, therefore that must mean I'm unlovable. Do you feel like that's kind of like something that the existentialists saw as well?
No, I think they would think that that's crazy, because love isn't, again, not a static thing, but love is an action. It's something that you do. It's something that you express through loving things that you do together. And what's important in a relationship is to figure out, well, what are those loving actions that are meaningful to the two people in the relationship. And it's not that love, it's not that love was never there, or it wasn't true love. I mean, that's another myth, this idea that there's one true love, or, a true love looks like you fall in love and you stay together forever, and that's a static relationship. But that's not at all, that's, the antithesis of freedom.
Yeah. And what I loved about your chapter in the book is when you were writing about your ex-boyfriend, that you pretty much, and another thing that I don't know if it's that common, where you pretty much said that you have no hard feelings toward him and that he was actually helpful for you in your growth. Can you talk a little bit about that? Would that be okay?
Yeah, I think so. I think the idea behind that is that, actually, let me bring it back to something Jean-Paul Sartre said, is that, lovers, when they're together for a while, or not even when they're together for a while, but just lovers can sometimes become very complacent towards each other, either because they're trying to keep the peace or keep the harmony, and so going back to what we were talking about earlier, that one of the ways we get to know ourselves is through the gaze of the other, and if the other's gaze is not really reflecting our being in any meaningful way, or just reflecting, saying, yeah, whatever you do is just fine, and not challenging us in any way, then that's problematic. And in fact, Sartre says that, sometimes enemies are better for understanding ourselves than friends, because they challenge us to think about ourselves, critically, and they push us in ways that, people who are so close to us sometimes don't see. And so I think that, what I appreciate about the existential view is that not only, thinking about the gaze of the other, of the person who's super close to us, but also, who hates us and what do they think of us, or who doesn't like us. And I mean, I made the mistake of kind of reading some reviews of my work online recently, and I'm like, but I did that because I wanted to get that critical feedback and criticism for, well, how could I do better in the future? I mean, I don't recommend doing that, but necessarily, because it can also be very depressing, but it can, in I think in small doses, it can be really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and so yeah.
Well,
Sorry, go ahead.
I think with the reviews, it's like, so the thing is, I think, like, they're okay in themselves, I guess, but the idea is, like, to sort of have a critical eye for them. Because obviously, it means most reviews do really come from kind of a deep sense of hatred for the other person for whatever reason. So I think, like, the idea is, like, to sort of ask yourself, is, like, this person, like, what is he, okay, first of all, what is this person saying? What do they actually mean? And then what is the evidence for what they're saying? And so, I mean, if there is evidence, it's kind of like going back to kind of Massimo's work with Stoicism. I think he said this in his part of the book, too, where he's pretty much saying something along the lines of like, look, if somebody gives you a criticism, right, you would essentially ask yourself, okay, is it possible that that criticism is true? How do we know that? And if it's not, then okay, then this person obviously has some sort of axe to grind with me, and this is kind of irrelevant information to me. And I kind of like that understanding of criticism and that conception of it.
Yeah. So sometimes it's just going to be like a Twitter troll. Right?
Yes.
They might not necessarily. Their feedback is useful, right, in general, because there's somebody who's taken the time to review your work, decided to comment, right? So in that sense, it's valuable.
Yeah.
But it depends, right? You can tell what is a real critical review and what's somebody just kind of hating on the work, right? So I suppose there is that distinction. But yeah, if you read too many reviews at once, it can be a little overwhelming.
Yeah.
It's,
Right, but I'm sure you have positive reviews as well, and plenty of them.
Yeah, I do. But it's sometimes the negative ones that kind of cut deep. But yeah, I mean, even like I said, I think it's important to take that on board and learn from it and grow from it, or figure out what's important to let go of. And the same in relationships, understanding what went wrong in previous relationships and what was, my responsibility. How could I do, or how could I be in a loving relationship in a better way in the future? And so I think, of all my past relationships, even if we don't speak anymore, I still am grateful for, the experience and the understanding that I gained from that. And in fact, that's something. Have you seen the Black Mirror episode Hang the DJ?
No, I'm going to see it.
Tell us about it.
I just wrote a chapter about it. So it's about a dating app, and part of what it does is it simulates relationships, I guess, in like a virtual world. Sorry, there may be spoiler alerts here, but I'll try not to do too many spoiler alerts.
Wait, is this the episode where like they try to match you with the perfect partner and you keep going through the list until you find your out? Yeah, I did see that episode. Yeah.
Yeah, so and the thing is that I guess the idea is that they're learning in the background, what's right, what works for you. Right. But I guess the problem that I have with that I wrote about in this chapter I co-authored with Massimo is that, all that learning, the people in real life aren't learning that themselves. Right. So it's kind of happening without their knowledge. And yeah, they might be getting to a shortcut for finding someone who seems to be compatible, but even that doesn't necessarily tell them that they're going to be compatible in the future. So that's kind of risky.
That's so interesting. And just to kind of go ahead. Go.
Yeah. This is what's interesting is the gratitude you have for your past relationships. Would you say that being able to maintain that sense of gratitude, even say after a relationship really went awry, like it really didn't work out? Would you say that's what true love is? It's like it's not that sort of attached sort of love. It's something that sort of still has this kind of deep appreciation for what you may have had for the person, or at least wanting maybe just good things for. Sorry?
What you learned?
Not just what you learned, not just like from that perspective, just also like I guess wanting good for them too. And I don't know. What would you say is if you had to have like a definition of what you think love without attachment would be, or true love in your eyes, what would you say that's like?
Well, I would be reluctant to use the word true because it implies that there's one fixed or one real right way of loving, and I don't think that's true at all. And existentialism, I think, is not like the Buddhist view of detachment. And in fact, the existentialists, if anything, are the opposite, which say, love is passion for the other person and being engaged. And I guess we find meaning in our lives through the attachments we have to other people. And in fact, in one of Beauvoir's novels, so this is a spoiler alert. She gets to the end and she's contemplating suicide because she's like, she's kind of older. She's not finding her job very meaningful. She thinks her husband would be happy with any other woman. And she suddenly hears her daughter outside and with her granddaughter, and then it kind of jolts her back into the world, and she thinks, wow, actually my death doesn't belong to me. It belongs, like, other people will live my death, but it's her attachment to her daughter and her granddaughter that kind of pulls her, back into the world. So I think the existential philosophers value that attachment much more than they would to be detached. But that doesn't mean but going back to what you were saying, yes, it's important to, I guess, move on and detach yourself from past relationships. But yeah, I don't think there's any clear, hard and fast definition of true love. But, the definition you spoke about earlier of authentic love, I think that's a really beautiful way to think about love, respecting and acknowledging one another's freedom and, figuring out goals together. And not trying to possess and dominate one another. And so that kind of love, in that definition, Beauvoir talks about, being together is an enrichment of the universe as well. So it's not just, the couple like sinking together into this selfish, solitude together, but actually acknowledging that where we live in relationship with other people and we have other attachments in the world.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
I love that.
Yeah.
I almost found like an answer that's sort of in the middle there.
Yes.
Like sometimes there's a need for detachment. Other times, or most of the time, there's a need for real engagement and being as attached as possible, actually. Mm-hmm. Because that's where the true passion is.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It's very interesting to think about. Yeah.
And it kind of also seems like when it comes to, like, I don't know, the perfect partner, the perfect relationship, the ideal is, again, kind of going back to Dan Savage, to find sort of this combination of a person who you accept as they are at that point, and then also somebody who wants to help you grow, and somebody who wants, obviously, you to help them grow as well. That kind of seems like if there is an ideal, that would be it. Mm-hmm. What do you guys think?
Yeah, definitely. It's like a mutual supporting of one another's goals. Not trying to say one person has to be dominant or submissive, but, a mutual kind of, support.
Yeah. And so, Skye, go ahead.
I'm so sorry.
Go for it. Because I can't see you.
So because we're talking about, Brene. So, we were talking about Esther Perel.
Yeah,
now I'm thinking about Brene Brown.
What about it?
So, in terms of, she said something that really, it was in a podcast with Tim Ferriss. It's about a week ago.
Yeah, I
something
listened
like
to
that.
that one too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what was interesting is she said, there's this common belief that marriage is always like 50-50.
Yes.
So, this person's pulling this much of the weight and this person's pulling that much, and it's all shared. And she said, no, that's a myth. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I could only pull 20 and he has to help me pull 80. Yep. Or sometimes I have to do the 80 and he has to do 20. Mm-hmm. Or sometimes I could do 30 and he could do 20 and we really have to talk, or something like that,
uh-huh.
And that's fascinating too. Her method, if I could remember correctly, I'm going to butcher it a little bit.
Go for it.
But the idea was, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about negotiating. Mm-hmm. She would just fully disclose what it is that's going on in her mind, or her... first she would say something that's good that her husband did, mm-hmm. and then talk about something else that she needed to have done or needed a little help with, mm-hmm. and he would do the same thing in return, and they had sort of this structure for how it is that they gave each other criticism, and how their partnership worked. And I really like that, because also she's like a world-class thinker in regards to relationships. So when I'm thinking, who should I listen to about this kind of stuff, like her method was interesting. Tim Ferriss himself also had his own with his girlfriend that he does. Can't remember it. I guess I have to rewatch it.
But something similar, I assume?
Something similar, yeah.
And I think pretty much we're all saying the same things. That it seems like the most important thing, or the most important facet of a relationship, is literally an understanding that a person cannot be everything for you all the time.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so since you mentioned Buddhism, I think this is like a really great sort of pivot point now. So in kind of Buddhist understanding or Buddhist philosophy, right, the way they kind of conceptualize meaning is a detachment, right? Sort of obviously kind of not necessarily a reincarnation, that's more Hindu, right? The way they kind of conceptualize life is sort of this rebirth of karma that obviously ends up in nirvana, right? So for them, sort of the purpose is detachment, right? There is a meaning. And so Skye, from the existentialist perspective, right, how do they conceptualize purpose? Like what does meaning look like to them?
So, I guess meaning is, it's complicated. First of all, it's up to us to decide meaning. Um, and they most of the existential philosophers come from this understanding that we live in there's no given meaning in the universe themselves because God is dead. And the existential philosophers all had different responses to this. So Albert Camus, for example, says that we have to live on the dizzying crest of despair, and you can't just create meaning where there is none. But of course, it's really hard to live like that. And even Camus actually found meaning kind of through rebellion, and that's what the Sisyphus myth is. Sisyphus pushing his rock up the hill just to let it roll back down. But he is rebellious, and he finds meaning in his rebellion, and because to be melancholy is to let the rock win. And so that's why he says we have to imagine Sisyphus happy. So Kierkegaard, for example, took a leap into Christianity because he thought, well, Christianity promises eternal happiness, so who doesn't want that? Mm-hmm. And Sartre, for example, he kind of leapt into, well, he flirted with Marxism, but I think ultimately he leapt into like whiskey and women and writing. No, I'm joking.
That sounds like a good life.
Yeah, but I think the point is that, there may be no stable foundation for us to, create meaning. There's no, guidebook, or, the guidebooks that we do have, like the Bible and stuff, they're kind of suspect. But I think meaning is, at least in the existential view, up to each of us to decide. And it's a really tough choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I had a friend, so I don't know if I still subscribe to, I like this idea. I've integrated it into my own personal philosophy, but he had this thing he used to say where to deal with this is how he dealt with the absurdity of existence. Mm-hmm. He would take the absurdity of existence and shove the absurdity down existence's throat. Like, kind of his own life was sort of a rebellion against the absurdity of existence. Mm-hmm. He would be as absurd as he felt life was. Mm-hmm. Which, when I first heard it, I thought that was very powerful. Mm-hmm. Like, even you could see me kind of emoting, like, but I don't know if I still subscribe to that. I have a bunch of ideas about that. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, I do have a question. So, Skye, for Camus, what did rebellion look like? Do you hear us?
Well, it's, sorry?
Oh, no. Oh, I think the time
There's a delay. No, go ahead.
Okay. No, oh, so yeah, there's a delay. No, so for Camus, what did the rebellion look like?
Yeah, I'm not really a Camus expert by any means, but I think it's really to live with lucidity and vitality, and just in terms of whatever our rock is, we've just got to keep pushing it. And I think I do like Camus' approach because some of us we have to go to work every day, and we tend to go on autopilot, and that can seem pretty absurd and stuff. But what's important is to just recognize that absurdity, but to, I guess, live in spite of it, and think about, look for meaning where we can, and look for I guess joy where we can.
And so how would you say, I mean, obviously this is going to be a bit of a complicated question, but like, in let's say the context like we talked about before, right? Sort of this kind of term that we haven't used here yet, but pretty much what we alluded to in the beginning of the show, something that De Beauvoir called facticities, right? So the facticities of life are pretty much these sort of givens of existence, right? The ones that we can't really avoid, like kind of our upbringing, right? The parents that we had, pretty much the community that we were raised in, whatever sort of traumas that kind of, we experienced. So how would the existentialist sort of view responsibility in that context, right? How can one sort of either create, I guess, what's called post-traumatic growth, or decide for themselves that they should take responsibility in that kind of context where it's obviously often so debilitating for people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I can't think offhand where they specifically talk about that, but certainly the existential view recognizes that, the world is filled with tragedy. And in fact, the philosophy became popular around, World War II, where you had this, absurdity and tragedy like every day. Often, people were being tortured and, they came up against really hard questions like, do you, betray your friends and, give away information, or how do you deal with that if you do. So I guess in terms of your question, like facticity, so they acknowledge that we're thrown into the world. There are certain facts that we can't change, where we can't choose to be born, for starters, can't choose who our parents are. But the existential project is kind of transcending those facts and pushing ourselves into the future. I find this, in some ways, it's similar to the Stoic view, like trying to figure out what you can control and what you can't control. But at the same time, the existential view is much less of a distinct dichotomy. And so on a personal level, I think it's like constantly, trying to work out, yes, what we can control and what we can't. But in terms of, on a broader level, I think if we're talking about injustices like during World War II, then I think especially Beauvoir would say, we have a responsibility to step up and kind of do something about it. She has this quote that says something like, immobile or in action, we always weigh upon the earth, and even refusal to act or refusal to speak is a choice. So doing nothing is still a choice. And she says, it's an impossible escape. So the point is that, yes, we're always responsible for our choices. And in post-traumatic growth, it's, yes, dealing with it on a personal level is one thing, but also changing the conditions of our lives so that those traumas and tragedies don't necessarily happen. That's important too. So that's where her kind of social justice comes into it.
Yeah. And I love that so much. It's like, because, the idea is that so many things that happen to us, and not even just to us specifically, obviously, to people who've even been through worse sort of, tragedies in their lives. It's not fair, right? And so, a lot of times people think where it's like it has to be one or the other. It's either life has to be fair or we have to give up. And unfortunately, it's really, or at least it doesn't have to be that simple, where the idea is that, even though you went through something that was really awful and maybe even really gruesome, that just the way the universe is structured, if you do want to make or create something out of your life, it would still be your responsibility. With help, obviously. It's not that you have to do it on your own, but the idea is that you're really the only one kind of at base who can actually make something of your life. Yeah, and that's what I love about the existentialists. They pretty much, the fact that they understand that we have to take responsibility for our lives. And it's it's a bit of a no-nonsense philosophy, right? It's kind of like, it's like we have to be the ones who sort of take control, right? And again, help is, it seems like within the philosophy that help is okay, but kind of fundamentally, right, that we're the ones who have to pretty much, and even in terms of the society, that we're the ones who have to kind of reshape the world in the best way that we can.
Yeah, and it's really hard to do that on our own, and that's why Beauvoir in particular kind of emphasized, creating solidarities and working together in order to challenge, the structures that we live in that kind of facilitate injustices.
Mm-hmm. And so, I guess the question for me is with Sartre and Beauvoir, right? So with his understanding of radical freedom, did he ever actually change it? Or did he kind of reconceptualize it after, I guess really having these deeper conversations with her? Did he still kind of hold on to it toward the end?
So he always said he would write, a bigger work on that and ethics, but he didn't get around to it. So he kind of, there are notes that suggest he was maybe reconceptualizing some things, but reconceptualizing in terms of kind of agreeing more with what Beauvoir was talking about, mm-hmm. And acknowledging that there are, limitations that, structural limitations on our freedom. And in fact, one of the arguments that they had was about a harem girl, who's locked, in a harem. She doesn't have many choices. And Sartre's argument was that, well, even like that kind of cloistered life can be lived in several different ways. But Beauvoir's point was like, well, fine, yeah, she's free to think as she chooses, but unless she has the power to actually act on her choices, then that kind of freedom is, it's meaningless. So she really emphasized, the importance of power to do or power to act in light of the choices that we want to make. And that was really what the second sex was very much about, was like this, why have women been the second sex for so long? And it's because of these structures that kind of channel them into subordinate roles.
Yeah.
I was just curious, are there any other philosophies that you, how should I put this, subscribe to, or that you have interest in? Maybe existentialism is the primary one, but is there anything that you like about other philosophies that maybe you kind of integrate into your own personal one?
I mean, there are a lot of different things about different philosophies that I like, and I haven't personally come up with like a comprehensive philosophy myself. I kind of see it as a work in progress, and certainly I like a lot of the existential ideas. And I think I very much like I like the Buddhism and how it aims to relieve pain and suffering, but I also like things like effective altruism, which is a very kind of action based philosophy, and really focused on it's probably one of the philosophies that's really making a big difference in the world. Thinking about encouraging us to choose or utilize whatever resources we have available to actually make the world a better place. So I really admire those more, and that gives a much more concrete path to actually doing something than, say, existentialism would. Yeah, and in the book How to Live a Good Life, there are 15 essays in there, and I'm like, I was like looking through and thinking, they all have parts that are really appealing. And so, yeah, I think it's really hard to choose just one, actually.
Yeah, that's what I noticed. Yeah, while reading the book, there were, like, for example, Stoicism is fascinating. Existentialism is fascinating. Buddhism, it's all...
He loves Buddhism.
Well, not primarily, but I do. Yeah, I like Buddhism. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I don't know. Personally, I wonder. I tend to integrate certain ideas from every single philosophy.
Mm-hmm. I think everybody does.
I hope so.
Yeah, or most people do. I definitely like that with therapy. Like, technically, nobody's really, like, with therapy, predominantly, like, either CBT or psychoanalytic therapists. Like, we all kind of integrate different skills and different methods. And I think we do that with our philosophy of lives, too.
I hope so.
Yeah.
You know why I say I hope so? I bet you somebody does exist that is
very... I'm sure.
like, black and white, thinking, like, no, this is the way.
Yes, right. I'm sure there are definitely people like that.
Yeah.
And then, so, Skye, one of our final questions is going to be, in terms of existentialists, how come you can't actually call yourself an existentialist?
Well, it's not that I can't call myself an existentialist.
Well, I'm sorry, not you in particular. I just mean, like, how come an existentialist doesn't... Yeah.
Well, it's because it's very, slapping a label on something, and that was something that the existential philosophers kind of veered away from, because they're like, human beings are so complex, they can't necessarily be defined by one specific thing, and the existentialist is kind of taking on a role and implying there's a specific set of, I guess, rules or doctrines or something to subscribe to, but there isn't that in existential philosophy. There's just some themes, and it's kind of always someone who looks at or tries to live by existential principles, or is always trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. So it's really complex, and it's also one of the reasons why I think they would have hated personality tests and stuff that put you into one of 16 boxes and things like that. They're like, no, life is really complicated.
Wow. And it kind of seems like a core, sort of one of the main, I guess, aspects of it is literally accepting just the uncertainty of life.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Dealing with the dread and sort of facing it head on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I agree.
Alen, final questions, thoughts?
Well, it does seem like, yeah, change is something that is constant, right? So, of course, you can't put anything into a label. It's, you could just, as, just for the, just to be conventional in language, using language and hoping to understand each other. But ultimately, I feel like that's a trick that most people kind of fall for, that there are these static like objects that always, you kind of, like, for example, even in terms of identity, right? A lot of people may think they are this person or believe in certain ideals and kind of fight and defend them to the death. But it's, if another perspective exists, right? I mean, how should I put this to you? The fact that there are other perspectives, right, tells you that there's not only one way to think about something. Right. That there's this thing called pluralistic thinking, right? That there's multiple perspectives, there's multiple ways to understand things, and knowing that there's no finite sort of way of looking at things,
right? True answer.
That's very important to know, because anytime then you hear something that's kind of conflicting or something different than what you're used to hearing, you may actually be open to hearing it if you're aware of these things, that there is other perspectives.
Yeah, and what the book makes clear is pretty much is that existentialism is an inclusive philosophy. That essentially what you can do is you can take that philosophy, right, and kind of it fits with other ones, except for like it seems like the religious ones are kind of let's say contradictory. But outside of that, like pretty much existentialism and Stoicism mix, right, sort of existentialism, and maybe even to some extent Buddhism. But what's so cool about it is that pretty much it allows you to see that life in itself is just this one big kind of ambiguous thing that we really have to just try our best to make sense of, knowing that there really is no sort of grand truth, or in terms of like how to live a life or how to live like the good life, there is no actual sort of blueprint that's really concrete and kind of a step-by-step thing.
Yeah, but though, and you said you mentioned religions, but I mean, Marcel was Catholic and Kierkegaard was a Christian. So in fact, like it can, gel with those kind of ideas. But I agree with what you were saying, that there's no set prescription. And Jean-Paul Sartre described it as more like guideposts. I'm like, that's the sort of direction you should be heading in, or that's like, these are some things you should think about. Don't follow us necessarily. We're not role models, but, we've thought about this a lot, and maybe you should think about this sort of thing too.
Yeah.
Actually, there is something I had to ask.
Shoot.
I can't believe I didn't ask this before. Okay. So, you have a black belt in Taekwondo, right? when did you get into Taekwondo?
It was a long time ago. I'm very rusty now, but I still practice with my son. He's 9, and so I still go along to family classes sometimes. But that was a long time ago. And in fact, I started it because my brother started doing it, and we were like young and we used to fight a lot. And then I realized, oh my goodness, he can actually kill me. And so I'm like, okay, I better keep up with this. And then we realized we could actually kill each other potentially. So our relationship was amazing after that. So we just got along great. So.
Because it's a high level. It's a black belt. It's not like that's why I'm thinking like, whoa, that's like a high level of mastery in something.
Wait, how long did you have to practice for it together? What's the timetable for a black belt?
I want to say, it might have been maybe 5 or 6 years.
That's a long time. Wow.
But I can't remember exactly. Yeah, practicing a few times a week.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Wow. All right, Skye, thank you so much for coming on today, man. What an insightful show.
Thanks, Leon. Thanks, Alen.
So if we were to find you, right, so where can we find you on social media?
Well, I'm mostly on Twitter, so at Skye_Cleary. But I also have a website, www.skycleary.com. So, yeah, they're the main places.
All right, thank you so much, Skye. And obviously, we'll be in touch soon.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you both.
See ya.
Okay.
Bye. All right, guys.
Wow, that was awesome.
Super insightful.
Skye was very cool.
Yeah. And guys, this is the book, How to Live a Good Life.
That's right. You can find it on Amazon And yeah, I believe
other
bookstores
platforms.
as well.
Pretty
Yeah,
much
absolutely.
just Google it, Amazon. I think it's on. So it's vintage, so you could definitely find it at the Vintage Publishing House, most definitely.
Absolutely. And if you want to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and Instagram, and at Seize_podcast on Twitter. Please like and subscribe.
Hit the bell on YouTube.
Hit the bell.
Yeah, and also find us at the O4L Online Network. So you can find us under the podcast section, where it's Seize the Moment Podcast and the Dinner Club.
Absolutely. And look forward to episode 41 next week.
Take care, guys.